Imagine a world where money isn't earned, it's declared. Where governments don't collect taxes to spend, they spend first and taxes come later, if ever. That world began not with a war or a revolution, but with a single law quietly passed in 1913. It created a machine that could conjure wealth from nothing, erase budget limits, and fund wars, bailouts, and empires without asking permission from the people. You've been told that Congress controls the purse, but what if the real power lies in something more hidden and far more dangerous? The most powerful law in modern history didn't set limits, it removed them. And once that door was open, it could never be closed. It began not with a revolution or a war, but with ink on paper, passed quietly 2 days before Christmas in 1913. While most Americans were preoccupied with the holiday season, Congress pushed through a law so profound that its consequences would shape the century to come. The Federal Reserve Act was sold as a response to financial instability, a reform designed to prevent panics like the crash of 1907. But hidden beneath the language of stability and modernization was something far more powerful. The legal foundation for a system that could manufacture money without the visible consent of the people. For the first time in American history, the government no longer needed to raise taxes before it spent. It could spend first and figure out the rest later. A central bank, composed of private regional banks coordinated under a Washington board, was now authorized to issue currency backed not by gold, but by government debt itself. The loop was elegant and invisible. The Treasury would issue bonds, the Federal Reserve would buy them, and new dollars would be born, not through productivity, but through promise. To the public, nothing changed immediately. There were no riots, no broken windows, no headlines screaming of betrayal. But behind the curtains, the financial architecture of America had been permanently rewritten. Power shifted from elected legislators to unelected central bankers. No longer would money be limited by taxation, gold reserves, or democratic debate. It would be dictated by policy, managed by experts, and justified by crisis. The law didn't abolish taxes, it made them optional for those with influence. It didn't destroy gold, it simply made it irrelevant. And it didn't empower the public. It insulated the monetary system from it entirely. What had once been the strict discipline of a limited currency became the open flexibility of a fiat one, with value based not on scarcity but on trust. That trust would be tested, broken, and rebuilt in new forms over the next 100 years, but the engine had been switched on. Future wars, recessions, pandemics, and bailouts would all rely on this single mechanism, made legal in 1913 to conjure liquidity out of thin air. The consequences wouldn't be felt immediately, but the countdown had begun. America had discovered the machinery of infinite money, and like all great machines of history, it would serve those who controlled it and trap those who didn't. The Fed was born with a pen stroke, quiet as snow, but its impact would echo louder than any cannon. Hidden within its mandate was not just the authority to manage money, but to redefine what money was. The public wouldn't realize what had happened until generations later, when debts became unpayable, markets became dependent, and money itself became something you borrowed into existence. The Constitution had once given Congress the power to coin money and regulate its value. That power was no longer theirs. It now belonged to a new institution, one designed not to be elected, not to be questioned, and not to be limited. The true magnitude of the Federal Reserve Act became clear only after the celebrations ended and the country returned to its routines, unaware that the most fundamental constraint on government power had just been dissolved. In the decades before 1913, money had been a physical promise, a certificate redeemable for gold that acted as a natural brake on political ambition. But the new system severed that connection with a quiet decisiveness that would reshape the American state. By allowing private reserve banks to issue currency backed by government bonds, the act created a closed loop in which debt produced money and money financed more debt. Gold, once the immovable anchor of the nation's financial integrity, was demoted to a ceremonial relic while the new architecture expanded behind the public facade of reform. Politicians presented the Federal Reserve as a guardian of stability, a neutral arbiter standing between the nation and financial panic. Yet the structure of the institution revealed different intentions. Regional reserve banks, privately owned by member banks, were now empowered to create credit in quantities that had no relationship to actual savings. The Treasury, no longer dependent on taxation to fund its ambitions, could issue bonds at will, confident that the Federal Reserve could transform them into spendable currency. The public saw a modernized banking system. Washington saw the birth of a monetary engine that could finance anything from war to welfare without asking permission from the citizenry. Few realized that democracy depends not only on the right to vote, but on the limits placed upon those who govern. By eliminating gold convertibility and enabling money creation through debt, those limits evaporated. The nation had quietly entered an era in which spending no longer required sacrifice, promises no longer required revenue, and future generations could be bound to obligations they never agreed to. Control shifted subtly but decisively from households to institutions, from savers to borrowers, from citizens to strategists. And with the gold constraint gone, the temptation to expand credit, government, influence became irresistible. The monetary system had been transformed from a measuring device into a lever, and those who learned to pull it would soon discover how profoundly it could reshape the world. When the first artillery shells shattered the silence of 1914, the world braced for the return of war. But few realized that something far more permanent was also being unleashed, a new way to pay for it. For centuries, war had been limited by money. Kings raised taxes, issued war bonds, or borrowed from private lenders with hard limits on what could be spent. But now, in the age of central banking, a different model emerged, one where money itself could be summoned into existence with nothing more than a government signature and a banker's nod. As Europe descended into chaos, the newly created Federal Reserve, barely a year old, became the hidden hand behind the financial transformation. Officially, the United States was neutral, but its bankers were anything but. By 1915, American financial institutions led by the House of Morgan were arranging massive loans to the Allied powers, funneling billions in credit through a system that bypassed the traditional mechanics of taxation and savings. The Federal Reserve didn't just tolerate this process, it made it possible. It provided liquidity, stabilized reserves, and ensured that America's financial markets could handle the surge of wartime demands. By the time the U.S. formally entered the war in 1917, it had already become the arsenal of democracy's creditors. The Treasury issued bonds and the Federal Reserve absorbed them, turning IOUs into dollars. The old gold standard would have balked at the scale, but the new system, built on belief, debt, and abstraction, expanded without friction. Americans were told they were buying Liberty bonds to support the troops, but few realized that the bonds weren't backed by real savings. They were backed by future taxes, future labor, and a central bank willing to conjure dollars on demand. The precedent was revolutionary. War no longer required economic sacrifice before the first shot was fired. It could be launched on credit, waged on fiat, and paid for by generations not yet born. The Fed's role wasn't military, but it was decisive. It had turned money into a weapon, quietly funding the most expensive war in human history without draining gold reserves or raising taxes to unbearable levels. And once the war ended, the system remained. Politicians had learned a new lesson. The constraints of old no longer applied. With the right monetary architecture, governments could finance the unthinkable and avoid the political consequences of asking the public to foot the bill. The alliance between central banks and national governments had proven itself in war and would soon become standard in peace. A dangerous truth had been revealed. With infinite credit, the limits of action were no longer economic but psychological. And those in power would not forget it. In the aftermath of World War I, what had begun as a temporary necessity hardened into a permanent strategy. The machinery of war financing, once justified by crisis, had proven too powerful to discard. By the 1920s, governments no longer viewed deficit spending as a reluctant resort. It had become the preferred instrument of economic management. The lessons of the war had rewritten the rules. Money could be created to meet political needs, not just reflect economic output. The gold standard, though technically still in place in parts of the world, had been hollowed out by emergency suspensions and backdoor manipulations. What remained was a hybrid system, half gold, half credit, held together by public faith and institutional sleight of hand. Politicians, economists, and central bankers had discovered that they could stimulate economies, fund infrastructure, and even pacify labor unrest without imposing unpopular tax hikes. Instead of asking citizens for their money, they borrowed against their future. The invisible hand of the central bank ensured the bills wouldn't come due anytime soon. The rise of Keynesian theory in the 1930s gave intellectual cover to what had already become political instinct. The idea that governments should spend during downturns wasn't new, but now it was gospel. Balanced budgets were labeled antiquated, a relic of gold-backed thinking. What mattered now was momentum. Keep demand high, keep credit flowing, keep money moving. The Great Depression only deepened this transformation. As economies stalled and unemployment soared, central banks and treasuries coordinated massive interventions, believing that enough spending could break the slump. And when the results fell short, the answer was always the same: more. Credit had become not just a means of payment, but the basis of national identity. Prosperity was measured in stock tickers and GDP growth, not savings or stability. The American dream itself was reframed as a debt-financed aspiration, home ownership, education, consumption, all made possible by lines of credit issued in the belief that future growth would cover present indulgence. Even when crises erupted, they were not seen as failures of the system, but as arguments for expanding it further. Banks that had overextended were bailed out. Currencies that wobbled were propped up. Governments that couldn't meet obligations were refinanced through international lending structures backed by central banks. The idea that money must come from somewhere, that value must be earned before it is spent, was quietly retired. It was replaced by a new faith, that as long as debt could be managed and markets believed, there was no ceiling. The world had entered an era where restraint was weakness, and the true currency of power was confidence in tomorrow. The state had become a perpetual borrower, and the people, though unaware, had become collateral. When the world plunged into another global war in 1939, the financial scale of the conflict dwarfed anything history had seen. Mobilizing entire populations, building fleets, manufacturing arms, and supplying armies across oceans required sums so vast that traditional taxation couldn't even begin to cover them. Yet governments no longer flinched at the cost. They had a tool their predecessors did not: the central bank. In the United States, the Federal Reserve became the silent partner in this grand mobilization, not by collecting taxes or minting coins, but by purchasing government debt in unprecedented volumes. As treasury bonds flooded the market to fund tanks, ships, and salaries, the Fed absorbed them, turning promises into currency. By the end of the war, the Fed owned over $20 billion in government securities, a staggering amount for the time. But this monetary expansion, which in earlier eras would have triggered panic and gold runs, was now absorbed with barely a ripple. Inflation ticked upward, but the public was told it was patriotic. Prices rose, wages were managed, and rationing disguised the monetary dilution. What mattered to officials was that the machine worked. Money appeared when needed, and war could be fought without bankrupting the state, at least visibly. This time, the cost of empire wasn't paid by taxpayers in advance, but by all citizens through slowly rising prices and eroded savings. The war itself provided the perfect cover story. Sacrifice was expected. Complexity shielded policy. And in the chaos of battlefronts and headlines, few noticed the deeper shift taking place beneath the numbers. Monetary expansion had become not just acceptable, it was institutional. The taboo had been shattered. Governments could spend trillions, create new dollars, and rely on the central bank to smooth the process. What once would have been seen as reckless inflation was now modern finance. And once the war ended, the machine didn't stop. Victory had proven the system's power. The mechanisms used to fund global conflict would now be retooled for global dominance. Reconstruction, foreign aid, infrastructure, and economic expansion all would be financed through the same pipeline of deficit and monetization. The logic was unassailable. If credit could defeat fascism, it could surely build prosperity. The world entered a new age where money was no longer a finite resource to be preserved, but a managed instrument to be wielded. Scarcity was old thinking. The post-war boom wasn't funded by savings. It was built on the quiet ability of governments to spend first and let central banks clean up the trail. This was not just a victory over foreign enemies. It was the final conquest of money itself. In the mountain resort of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, as World War II still raged across continents, a new financial empire was quietly being designed behind closed doors. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered to build what was sold as a blueprint for post-war stability. But beneath the language of cooperation and reconstruction lay the architecture of something far more enduring: dollar dominance. The gold standard had proven too rigid, too inflexible for the modern ambitions of empire and economic management. The new system offered a compromise. Currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar would remain convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, but only for central banks, not private citizens. It was a clever arrangement. America, which held over 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, became the anchor of the entire global system. Foreign nations needed dollars to engage in trade, build reserves, and stabilize their economies. The more they grew, the more dollars they needed. And to supply them, the United States had to do something counterintuitive. It had to run deficits. This was the birth of the Triffin paradox, where global demand for the dollar forced the US to print more money than it could ever redeem in gold. Through the 1950s and 60s, the dollar spread like wildfire across the globe, financing European recovery, Japanese industry, and multinational trade. But every new dollar issued abroad came with a promise that it could, if requested, be redeemed for gold. By the mid-1960s, those promises exceeded America's gold holdings. The math no longer worked. Countries like France, led by Charles de Gaulle, began demanding real metal in place of paper. Gold drained from Fort Knox in alarming volumes. The facade began to crack. American officials downplayed the imbalance, dismissing concerns as outdated thinking. But behind the scenes, panic was building. The global system was built on a promise that had become physically impossible to keep. The dollar was no longer tethered to a vault. It was floating on belief, inertia, and American military power. Foreign nations now held stacks of IOUs that could never be honored, and they knew it. The elegant machine built at Bretton Woods had become a pressure cooker, with confidence as its only release valve. As more countries lined up for redemptions, the United States faced an unthinkable choice: surrender its gold or surrender the game. It chose the latter. The system had reached its breaking point, and soon the world would watch the collapse of convertibility and the birth of a fully fiat era. But in that final stretch before the fall, one thing became clear. Bretton Woods was never about shared stability. It was about constructing a monetary empire where deficits became strategy, and the dollar became both the fuel and the fuse. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon sat in front of the American people and calmly announced a decision that would sever the last link between money and reality. With a few carefully chosen words, he declared the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold, a promise first made at Bretton Woods and now mathematically impossible to keep. But what was framed as a short-term emergency measure was, in truth, the final act in a transformation that had begun nearly 6 decades earlier. From that moment forward, the US dollar was no longer backed by anything finite. It wasn't exchangeable for gold, silver, or even oil. It was backed solely by confidence. Confidence in government promises, central bank policy, and the assumption that everyone else would continue to play along. Convertibility had once been a discipline, forcing countries to live within their means. Without it, there were no limits, only narratives. And the new narrative was simple. The dollar is money because we say it is. Beneath the surface, policymakers had long seen the inevitable. Foreign central banks were demanding more gold than America could deliver. Fort Knox was bleeding reserves. Confidence was cracking. Nixon's advisors knew the game was up, but rather than confess the system's failure, they rebranded it as a new age of flexibility. The dollar would now float, markets would adjust naturally, and inflation would be managed through policy. But inflation wasn't manageable. In the years that followed, prices exploded, the cost of living soared. Savers were punished as the purchasing power of the dollar eroded month after month. For the first time, Americans experienced what it meant to live under a currency not restrained by metal or math, but by the shifting strategies of unelected central bankers. The Federal Reserve, once a backroom liquidity provider, now became the axis of economic life. Markets no longer feared fiscal excess. They anticipated central bank intervention. Politicians no longer needed to justify spending. They just needed the Fed to absorb the debt. Monetary policy had become the keystone of national power, and inflation became its unintended but tolerated consequence. The post-1971 world ushered in an era of illusion. Budget debates were no longer about how to raise money, but how much could be borrowed without triggering panic. Economic growth was increasingly financed by credit, not production. And the value of money was no longer measured in ounces or coins, but in spreadsheets and market expectations. What had started as a technical adjustment in 1913 had, by 1971, become a system of infinite issuance, a monetary regime with no brakes, only gas pedals. The gold standard hadn't just died, it had been murdered quietly, replaced by a doctrine that money itself could be managed like a story. But stories change, and belief is fragile. The world now floated on a dollar with no tether, and the only thing holding the system together was the hope that no one would ask too many questions. The moment the dollar was untethered from gold, the logic of restraint evaporated, and in its place emerged a system that not only survived crisis, but thrived on it. The financial world had entered a new evolutionary phase where every disaster, every panic, and every geopolitical shock became a pretext to expand the state's power to create and deploy money. In 1987, the first test arrived when the stock market crashed 22% in a single day. The Federal Reserve responded not with fear, but with innovation, flooding the system with liquidity and pledging to support the financial markets directly. The crash was contained, but a new lesson was learned. The Fed could act as a guarantor of asset prices. Then came the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s. When it burst, central banks slashed rates and pumped liquidity into the system, cushioning the blow. But the excesses didn't go away. They migrated. Housing became the new bubble. And when it popped in 2008, the scale of intervention reached a new dimension. The global financial crisis triggered the most aggressive monetary response in modern history. Interest rates were cut to zero. The Fed's balance sheet tripled as it purchased toxic mortgage-backed securities and U.S. Treasuries in what it called quantitative easing, a sterile term for printing money to buy collapsing assets. Meanwhile, government borrowing exploded as trillions were poured into bailouts, stimulus checks, and backstops. The crisis revealed what insiders had already suspected. The line between fiscal and monetary policy was gone. The Treasury spent and the Fed monetized. The discipline of markets was replaced by the doctrine of intervention. Every bank deemed too big to fail was rescued. Every bond deemed too important to default was supported. And the public, unaware of the transformation, watched as their future was quietly mortgaged to maintain present-day illusions. But it didn't stop there. After 2008 came 9/11, then the European debt crisis, then the taper tantrum of 2013. Each time followed by new policies, new tools, new justifications for central banks to do more. What had once been emergency measures became permanent fixtures. The Fed went from lender of last resort to first responder for every economic ailment. Markets no longer feared downturns, they anticipated the Fed's reaction. Every risk became a buying opportunity because investors knew the Fed would not let the system collapse. The cost of this addiction to intervention was paid in moral hazard, inflated asset prices, and the quiet decimation of the middle class, whose wages stagnated while financial speculation flourished. The architecture created in 1913, expanded in 1944, unchained in 1971, had now matured into something that didn't just accommodate crisis, it demanded it. Every emergency became a mechanism for greater centralization, more liquidity, and deeper entanglement between Wall Street and Washington. The system had evolved not toward stability, but toward permanence through expansion. There was no longer a reset button, only acceleration. In the spring of 2020, as the world locked down and economies ground to a halt, an old question resurfaced with new urgency. How can governments afford to spend trillions without collecting it first? For over a century, the answer had been inching into view, but the COVID-19 pandemic brought it into full light. They don't need to collect it, they create it. Practically overnight, central banks and governments shed the last remnants of fiscal restraint. Trillions of dollars in stimulus were announced with no real debate, no tax increases, no offsetting cuts, just raw numbers added to spreadsheets and distributed to households, corporations, and financial markets. The Federal Reserve crossed the final Rubicon, openly purchasing vast quantities of U.S. government debt, while simultaneously backing corporate bond markets, municipal debt, and even junk-rated securities. The Treasury borrowed and the Fed bought, often within days. The distinction between fiscal and monetary authority collapsed entirely. It wasn't just coordination anymore, it was convergence. The balance sheets of the Fed and the federal government became two sides of the same coin, spinning ever faster. What had once been dismissed as radical modern monetary theory, the idea that sovereign issuers of currency could spend without financial constraint so long as inflation was contained, was now policy in real time. But instead of sparking a political revolution, it was administered by technocrats and announced via press releases. Central banks had become the funding arm of the state, and the state had become the permanent driver of credit creation. With interest rates pinned at zero, the cost of borrowing disappeared. Deficits no longer mattered, not because they were resolved, but because they were absorbed. Market participants, far from resisting, cheered. Stock markets soared as the real economy stalled. Trillions flowed into financial assets, while businesses shuttered and households faced eviction. But money was no longer allocated by price signals or market competition. It was administered by decree. Whether a company lived or died depended not on its business model, but on its access to stimulus pipelines. Whether a household stayed solvent depended on a relief check digitally conjured into existence. The mechanisms were complex: special purpose vehicles, yield curve control, liquidity facilities. But the outcome was simple. Money had become a utility, deployed at scale by governments and financed on demand by their central banks. Inflation, long dormant, began to stir, but officials insisted it was transitory, even as purchasing power visibly declined. And the public, desperate for security in a time of uncertainty, accepted the trade-off. In the name of public health and economic survival, the state had discovered its final form: infinite spender, infinite borrower. The financial system had become a sovereign apparatus of credit creation, untethered from revenue, consequence, or consent. The COVID shock had not just triggered unprecedented spending, it revealed that the brakes had long been disconnected. There was no longer a line between the real and the invented. There was only the screen, the statement, the number. A century after that quiet December law, the American financial system no longer resembles the world it once served. The dollar, once a claim on gold, then a claim on government, and now a claim on itself, has become an abstract instrument of policy, untethered from the limits of nature or human production. Money has transformed from a measure of value to a mechanism of power. Debts, once assumed to be paid back, now serve as perpetual motion machines, rolling forward, refinancing endlessly, their magnitude no longer measured in practical terms but in trillions, each digit eroding meaning. Congress debates budgets with numbers so large that even their context has dissolved. The word trillion elicits little more than a resigned shrug. Yet every spending bill, every monetary program, every crisis response builds on the same principle unleashed in 1913. If more is needed, more will be created. The United States sits atop a mountain of obligations: Social Security, Medicare, military commitments, infrastructure decay, and the invisible guarantees that prop up entire markets. The private sector, too, has adapted. Households and corporations borrow, speculate, and invest on the assumption that credit will always expand, and that policymakers will intervene at the first sign of instability. What was once the discipline of saving for tomorrow has been replaced by the expectation of perpetual rescue. As debts eclipse $33 trillion, the numbers become so vast that future generations, whose names and faces are unknown, are conscripted as collateral for today's ambitions. Yet the bill for infinite money is paid not just in inflation or lost purchasing power, but in the corrosion of trust. Money, after all, is belief made tangible. When every promise can be financed and every liability rolled over, the concept of value itself begins to dissolve. The endgame is not a singular collapse, but a creeping transformation. Market discipline replaced by policy, individual planning replaced by institutional management, risk replaced by guarantees that never truly guarantee. Central banks stand as the new high priests, their pronouncements and interventions shaping reality as much as reporting it. The paradox is that as money became limitless, it also became weightless, a tool of power and narrative, unmoored from the lives of those it was meant to serve. The ultimate convergence is here. Currency as credit, government as spender of last resort, restraint as nostalgia for a vanished world. The final question is not whether the system will break, but what will emerge from its ruins, because the law that gave governments unlimited money has now reached its final logic, and the next chapter waits, unwritten on the other side of belief.